once again to Edge of Reality TV. I am Willie Hassel, along with Lynn Nickerson.
Hi.
And how are you doing tonight, Lynn?
Terrific, and yourself?
I'm doing pretty good.
Good.
Pretty good.
You're motivating a little bit better?
I am. I'm getting around. I'm driving. I'm walking.
Yep, you're recuperating.
I survived. I'm recuperating quite well.
Yes, glad you're not still in rehab.
Careful how you use that word, rehab. Hey, we got a great guest tonight.
Very interesting.
Yes, very interesting. He was on the radio show with us not too long ago.
Yeah, we really enjoyed that.
And so tonight on Edge of Reality TV, it is a pleasure to welcome to the show David S. Brody. David is a graduate of Tufts University and Georgetown School of Law. He is a Boston Globe best-selling fiction author and author of 9 novels. He is a former director of the New England Antiquities Research Association and an avid researcher of pre-Columbian exploration of America. He has appeared on several times as a guest expert on documentaries on the History Channel, the Travel Channel, PBS, as well as the Discovery Channel. And David is joining us tonight to talk about his latest book, Echoes of Atlantis, Crones, Templars, and the Lost Continent. Let's welcome to Edge of Reality TV, David Brody. Good evening, David. Welcome.
Thank you for having me, both of you. Yes.
Nice to have you.
Thank you for coming.
Well, tell us about being on the Discovery Channel and the Travel Channel. You were asked about...
What shows were you on then?
So, interesting, this whole field of study you mentioned in the biography, pre-Columbian exploration of America. And what that is people like myself believe that there were groups of Europeans or Mediterranean people who came over prior to Columbus. There's not many of us, and so when they need somebody to go on TV and talk about it, there's only a small group of us.
Elite club.
Elite or perhaps a fringe club is what they like to describe it. But it's interesting because I started doing this about 10 years ago. I sort of went down the rabbit hole of people being here before Columbus. You know, we're not talking about the Vikings, we're talking other groups. And I've been ferreting around in the dusty corners of history for the past decade, looking at this stuff. And I think I might need a change of clothes and a shower, perhaps. But the interesting thing is in that last decade, I've really seen a lot of change in the way even mainstream historians start to look at this. And a decade ago, it was really like the idea of people being here before Columbus was like, no, no, no. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and we can't get past that. But again, even in the last 10 years.
You think they're breaking that ceiling now?
We are. I like to talk of like sort of redirecting the ocean liner. It takes a long time. But there's been a lot of shows on History Channel, America Unearthed, and Curse of Oak Island, and Search of Lost Giants, and a number of shows. And people are starting to think, well, yeah, we know the Vikings were here, say, 1,000 years ago, and we know Christopher Columbus was here 500 years ago. Why couldn't people have come back and forth in between those 2 time periods?
They didn't think that they could possibly make it voyage-wise. You know,
but we know the Vikings did. We know
did.
for a fact the Vikings did. So for 500 years people just forgot how to do it? Or more likely, I think people did come back and forth and they kept it secret because it was an advantage for trade or an advantage for whatever they were trying to do. So to answer your first question, there weren't many people out there looking at this kind of history 10 years ago, 8 years ago. And so again, they were stuck with me basically on these shows. So, but I enjoy doing them. I enjoy talking about this. I've always been fascinated by history, and as a second grader, I remember looking at the timeline the teacher put up on the board with Columbus, and then before that the Vikings, and I raised my little hand and said, how come nobody came back and forth afterwards? And she sort of looked at me and said,
did you really in the 4th grade?
Second grade. Mrs. North,
really?
if you're out there, Mrs. North, you'll remember this question. And she said, I don't know, that's a good question. Maybe someday you can answer that question. And
there's something missing here, he says.
So, yes, something, and so here I am now.
And even predating that, there's suspicion that the Phoenicians were coming here as well, and looking for perhaps a copper, and sailing up the Mississippi, because there are old copper mines up there.
Up in the Lake Superior area.
Right, and into Michigan and Wisconsin.
Right.
So it's not such an outlandish idea. And you know, I had also continued the study for your book. I was reading this one here, Celtic Mysteries by Imbrogno and Marianne Horgan. Right. And they were talking about a flint spearhead that had been found in one of the stone chambers in upstate New York.
Right.
And it was 8 inches long, and they have dated that to 4,000 years old, at least 2000 BC.
Right.
So, you know, that is one of the first pieces of evidence that are predating those stone chambers beyond colonial times.
Right, and the site up in not far from here in Salem, New Hampshire, the America Stonehenge site, there's a number of
That's another good example.
pieces of evidence, Phoenicians, we think, and dating back to maybe 3,500 years ago. And I like to say that when I first started talking about things like 600 years ago before Columbus, and 1,500 years ago with Brendan the Navigator, and then 3,500 years ago the Phoenicians, you know, those are time periods that historians can measure. When we start talking about Atlantis, and it's 12,000 years ago.
12,000.
Now I like to say that I can't be proven wrong for 12,000 years ago. It's almost freeing. But I think you're very right that when we go back even 4,000 years ago, there's evidence going back to that time period regularly of people coming back and forth across the Atlantic. The Phoenicians were great seafarers. They were the merchant marine of the Egyptians, and they circumnavigated Africa, and they almost couldn't help but being blown off course once in a while, and then ending up in Brazil.
Yeah.
And so it's almost silly for us to think that they didn't come.
And even one of those stone chambers, they were digging underneath it, and what they were finding was below the strata, of course, soil, and then they found stone slab flooring. And they took out one of the pieces, and they went down about 6 inches, and they discovered a layer of clay. And there was the indication that that clay was a result of just after the Ice Age. And they were dating it like 18,000 years ago, so 16,000 years ago, the Ice Age. So the stone chamber might have been built not long after that.
And this is upstate New York?
Upstate New York. Fainstock, New York?
Fainstock, yeah.
Okay. There were 2 chambers there that they were investigating, and they really haven't got a lot of exact data, but that is a pretty good indication of several thousand years further back.
And that's what I found in my research. Again, looking at the evidence of Atlantis, the lost colony of Atlantis, we're going back, you know, the Ice Age ended, many historians believe, or geologists believe, with some kind of cataclysmic event, a meteorite or an asteroid. And that end of the Ice Age is also the cataclysmic event which brought about the downfall of Atlantis. And we're talking, again, 12,000 years ago, thereabouts. And so, of course, the trail is cold. Trying to find evidence from back then is really hard. And you have to, there's not enough geological evidence, and there's not enough archaeological evidence, there's not enough linguistic evidence. But if you take pieces of evidence from all these different disciplines, you can build a case. And that's my training as a lawyer. You know, my training is to take evidence and analyze it and organize it in such a way and try to build a case. It's a lot more liberating than being a scientist, where we have the scientific method where we follow the evidence along to its natural conclusion point. I get to decide where I want to go first and then look for evidence afterwards. So it's not quite as rigorous. But we still, in the end, we need the evidence if we're going to tell people, if we're going to convince people that maybe these things happen, that maybe there was an Atlantis, that was an advanced civilization that had some kind of cataclysmic event cause it to end, and that a few people survived, and that they brought with them, carried forward with them some of their technologies and some of their beliefs and some of their culture, and there are bits of that survive even down to today. And that's why I called my novel The Echoes of Atlantis, because that's really what we're finding, is these distant echoes, pieces of evidence that resound still today.
Yeah.
Something was going on back then.
So in your series, this is what number in your series?
This is number 6 in my series of the ancient histories.
And you did say that this is sort of a standalone book, but it's about the same protagonist, Cameron and his wife.
Exactly.
And what is so really cool about this, of course, we're in Haverhill, Massachusetts. The setting takes place in Westford, Mass, and that's really really neat.
And all around the area, really, Salisbury.
Exactly.
As I mentioned to you on the radio show, I grew up right there in Newburyport. Right on the other side of the river.
Right on the other side of the river, right.
From where a lot of this took place.
And we find that whenever we're talking about explorers coming to this area of New England, the Merrimack River obviously was the highway they would be using. So that's why we find all this evidence, Newburyport and Salisbury, and then down into Lowell and Tingsboro, and off of into Westford, and then up into New Hampshire. And we find a lot of these artifacts along the Merrimack River.
And the point being that you've incorporated so much of this into the story, so that the artifacts that you mentioned, so forth, are all real. It's just the story that is a story. It's a novel, but the rest of it is all very real.
And I gotta say, I love the way you wrote it with, you know, bringing the fictional story and the facts together. I think you did a great job.
They say to young writers, you know, write in the genre that you love to read, And I love to read historical fiction. I love to learn about the history, but I also like to have it being taught to me during a roller coaster ride. So that's what I try. That's what I try to write. You know, I think that's a fun way to be educated.
Well, I think it's very similar in its style, the style of format to Da Vinci Code, Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, because it's that dynamic. Something is happening continually.
Another northern Massachusetts resident.
That's right. That's right. And he even went to school in Exeter.
There you go.
Exeter, New Hampshire. Very cool. So regarding Cameron and Astarte and then his wife, and I just forgot his wife's name.
Amanda.
Amanda. Would you give us a little background on what Cameron and Amanda about and who Astarte is?
Right. So Cameron was the original protagonist in the first book, Cabal of the Westford Knight. He's a 40-something attorney who, in that book, had just been disbarred because his firm had been representing the Catholic Church in the sexual abuse cases, and he just couldn't take it anymore because he was on the wrong side of that case, and he leaked.
Read that too.
Yeah, he leaked evidence to the newspaper, and the Bar Association found out about it, and they disbarred him, or almost disbarred him. And so he sort of was down and out. He came back to his hometown of Westford, and he stumbles upon this local mystery called the Westford Knight legend, in which, again, the legend is that about 600 years ago, some Scottish explorers island hopped their way across the North Atlantic, following the path of the Vikings, and ended up in Westford. And while there, one of their party died, and they carved an effigy in the rock ledge to commemorate the death of this fallen comrade, and that's the Westford Knight carving, and we still have that today in Westford. So Cameron sort of stumbles upon this mystery while he's back in Westford, and his cousin ends up getting badly injured as they're investigating this, and it's clear that there's some nefarious players who are trying to prevent them from learning more about the mystery. And he eventually meets a librarian or a researcher by the name of Amanda, who's come over from Great Britain to help with the research of the Westford Knight. And he is referred to her as sort of the expert. And so that's the love interest that eventually blossoms into by book 6, they're married. But they end up together. Again, you mentioned the Da Vinci Code. It's the same kind of formula where
it is.
A young couple are thrown together, and all of a sudden they're on the run. And Cameron and Amanda basically take a tour of New England, looking at all the sites, not just in Westford, but all around New England, the Newport Tower. There's some rune stones up in Maine called the Spirit Pond Rune Stones. There's another rune stone in Narragansett Bay called the Narragansett Rune Stone. All these artifacts and sites that seem to indicate that something was going on here with Scandinavian or European explorers a couple hundred years before Columbus. And so they go out looking for the clues, and eventually they put the clues together and try to figure out what's going on, and that's how the whole thing starts. Eventually they end up meeting young Astarte, who at the time was an 8-year-old girl who was living with her uncle. The uncle ends up dying, and eventually they end up adopting Astarte, and she's a Native American princess. And there's a legend that goes along with her as well, and that sort of carries the second novel in the series. And she's now growing up now. She's 11 or 12 in this story. And she becomes, in the book I'm working on now, she becomes really a major, major player in the 7th book in the series. But
Astarte, is that actually a Greek name or a Native American name?
It's not Native American. It's a play off. I don't know if it's Canaanite or it's Middle Eastern.
It's Middle Eastern.
Similar to the word Ishtar, which is Isis.
Okay.
The word Easter is the celebration of fertility, the goddess Ishtar, and Astarte is I believe it's Sumerian is the name, but this is all the same root as Isis. Essentially, is the best way to think of it. The little goddess.
Well, there's an underlying theme of the Knights Templar being involved, and maybe a little scintilla of the Freemasons and so forth. Mm-hmm. So you say that if they're on a roller coaster ride, they always seem to kind of be on the run. Why is it, do you suppose? I mean, they're finding this evidence that sort of refutes accepted history.
Right.
So why do you suppose that they're sort of being challenged and almost threatened throughout the course of these books? Why is it, do you think, that they want to hide, they wanting the history to be hidden, and the threats coming? So why do you suppose that's happening?
So that's one of the hard things about fashioning these novels is they're finding enough villains that we want that would want to suppress this history. In this particular book, in The Echoes of Atlantis, the villain, the person trying to prevent this from happening, happens to own a major corporation that does a lot of mining and drilling in the ocean.
That's right.
And
yes.
in
Gottlieb.
there's a very obscure United Nations treaty that essentially says no mining or drilling can be done any place in the oceans where we have evidence of a past civilization.
For the last 100 years.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Anything prior to
beyond 100 years.
1917 or whatever. It's 100 years. And of course, that's not usually a big deal because these mining companies and drilling companies are operating in the middle of the Atlantic, and of course, there's no civilization. Yeah. But he realizes that if it turns out there was an Atlantis in the middle of the Atlantic, it's essentially going to shut down his company, because who wants to go in front of the United Nations and try to get an archaeological dig permit every time you want to dig? It's a bureaucratic nightmare. And so he's the, I hope I didn't give away the story, but he's one of the villains in this story. So coming up with the ideas as to why people would want to prevent this history from being discovered, that's where I really have to sort of put on my legal hat. In this particular case, I have to find this obscure United Nations treaty, and that's what the plot hangs on in many ways as far as the villain goes. But in every one of the stories, I have to find something that, the obvious choice is, well, in the Da Vinci Code, the church didn't want the truth of the bloodline coming out. Okay, so yes. That's an easy one to do, but there has to be other reasons that powerful groups don't want this truth to come out, and that's always a hard thing as the fiction writer to come up with, because the stakes have to be high enough. I mean, people aren't going to commit mayhem and murder over a parking ticket. There has to be high stakes involved. There's got to be a lot of money behind it. Follow the money. Always follow the money. Yes, that's always a good way to solve these mysteries. Yes.
But in regards to, say, like Columbus coming here first, there was a big push not to consider previous explorers having been here. What do you suppose is behind that? Do you think the Knights Templar is kind of what's behind that?
So I misunderstood your other question. You don't want to know what's behind it in my novels. What's really behind it? That's an interesting question.
Well, there are different instances or different aspects of it, but I'm wondering.
But you're right, because you've touched on something, because we do find, even when we do our research, people like myself go out, there's a huge hesitancy and resistance against us rewriting the history timeline. It's almost like you're asking people to stop believing in the Easter Bunny.
After like sacrilege.
Again, in second grade we were taught about Columbus, and people just have trouble getting by that. But more importantly, there are many historians, professional archaeologists, our state archaeologists in the state of Massachusetts is a good example. They've gone on record publicly stating there was nobody here before Columbus, in no uncertain terms, and they've really staked their reputations on it. And if it turns out that they're wrong, they've really got a lot of egg on their face. And so instead of, you would think academic types would be open-minded in the scientific method, and anything's possible. History is always rewriting itself. But in certain areas, we're finding just plain old stubbornness. Like, really, you won't even come out and look at this? Like, no, I know for a fact it never happened. I'm not even going to come look at it. It's like, well, how do you argue something like that? But I think the motivation going on there really is reputation. Again, people's reputations are at stake, and they've just dug in their heels, and that's as far as they're going to go.
Look what the Smithsonian is doing with all of the giant bones that they keep concealing and saying that don't exist.
Right, so that was one of my novels, the fourth in the series. I wrote all about the giant bones.
Oh, would you mention that?
Yeah, it's called The Oath of Nimrod. And you're right, there was, someone documented about 1,500 examples in the late 1800s and early 1900s.
There was a lot, late 1800s.
Newspaper articles documenting farmers going out into the fields, the pioneering farming families, and finding, as they're digging, these massive skeletons, human skeletons. I'm not talking 15 or 20 feet, but I'm talking 8, 9, even 10 feet tall, human skeletons. And these stories over and over again tell the same story, where the local surgeon was called, the local judge was called, they documented, they display the bones in City Hall. And of course, eventually the bones decay because they're out in the air, and that's why they're not around. Once in a while, the Smithsonian would come and take the bones, put them into storage, and they've now disappeared. But we see this over and over again, 1,500 different examples. And oftentimes, the details were very similar. You have bones in Georgia, and the story is very similar to the bones in North Dakota. They didn't have the internet back then, but oftentimes you had extra digits on the hands, and oftentimes a second row of teeth.
A second row of teeth. How bizarre.
So it's not like somebody in Georgia came up with this idea, let's give the the giant a second row of teeth like some kind of monster, and then somebody in North Dakota had the same idea, and somebody in California had the same idea. We see it over and over again, and I talk a lot about in my books this idea of, you know, independent invention, or do we have a common source? And when I think we start seeing these obscure stories being repeated in thousands of miles apart, that it probably all comes from a common source, which may be the truth in this case, as opposed to everyone sort of making it up on their own.
Are you of the opinion that there could possibly be could have been several races of giants, given that some had extra digits or some had extra rows of teeth, and then there were some gargantuan sizes to these things? And fortunately, you know, DNA analysis is very expensive. It would be so cool if we could, you know, do a cross section.
So people think I'm crazy to think there's one race of giant. You want me to go to 2 or 3 now?
You're
really going to send me way out on the thin ice. Like
I got your back.
I think if we can get to 1, we've made a lot of headway. There are some interesting biological formulas that are used. It's called, I forget what it's called, but essentially when you double the height of a human, you now triple their weight.
Oh.
And at some point, we get to a certain height where our skeletal mass doesn't support ourselves.
Okay.
It's like the way elephants are so lumbering. You know? If humans were of that same, they have 4 legs instead of 2. We can't get much above 9 or 10 feet as humans and still not collapse on ourselves.
Yeah.
So the idea that at some point we were 15 or 20 feet tall, that would have to be a whole different race, because our skeletons don't allow us to do that. But we can easily get to 9 or 10, not easily, but we can get to 9 or 10 feet biologically without violating any of those laws of nature. And I think when we're talking about giants, that's what I think we're talking about, that height. A race of, or a tribe, or whatever you want to call it, of humans, perhaps coming from the hills of Lebanon, which is where the Bible tells us.
That's right.
And I think this ties back into what you said earlier with the Phoenicians, that if the Phoenicians did come to North America 3,500, 4,000 years ago to mine for copper, wouldn't they bring their strongest guys with them?
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, and so
Yeah,
that may be how the giants ended up here. In fact, there's a burial mound of a giant in Ohio, and I believe it's called the, it's not the Bat Creek, it's another creek mound, and in the burial mound there's an inscription in an ancient Phoenician script that talks about the king. They call him a king, but very interesting that the intersection of the giant skeleton and the Phoenician script in this burial mound in Ohio.
And it's Phoenician.
It's Phoenician.
Wow.
So, so that's always sort of made sense to me, that if there were giants in North America, that perhaps the source of them. Oh, by the way, the Native American legends, the Cherokee legends,
they talk
about this war they had with the giants.
Right.
Yeah, but it always made sense to me that they may have come from Lebanon with the Phoenicians who we think came here to mine copper.
Let me ask, contingent on that, Ogham. How far back does Ogham go? Isn't that the language of the Celts?
Ogham is the language of the Celts, and it's also the language of the, well, when we talk about the Celts, most people think of Ireland, but the Celts actually go back even earlier to Portugal, the Iberian Peninsula. And the earliest forms of Ogham are found in southern Portugal.
Oh.
People don't realize that the Portuguese sort of are the fathers of the ancestors of the Celts from Ireland. That's how that migration.
Didn't they migrate north?
Exactly.
From the Basque area.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So even the Basque area is one of the stop points, but even before that, they were on the southern coast of Portugal.
Portugal.
But when we talk about the ancient Celts, we're talking about on Iberia, and then of course, when we talk about the Celts, most of the Ogham we find in North America. That Barry Fell documented in his book, America BC, back in the 1970s. Barry Fell was a professor at Harvard. Most of that Ogham, he believed, was Irish, and we're talking probably about 500 or 600 AD. And I've always thought that was related to the Brendan the Navigator legends of the Irish monks coming across, and an explorer by the name of, an adventurer by the name of Tim Severin in the 1970s, I believe, reproduced, he rebuilt a boat similar to the way Brendan would have gone across.
That's right, and he went on his voyage.
He went on a voyage, and it was essentially a boat made of animal skins. Not even wood, it was an animal skin boat. And Severin left Ireland and came all the way across and landed, I believe, in Newfoundland.
And when did he do that? And he was imitating what time period?
He was imitating Brendan the Navigator from about 550 AD, 520 to 550 AD, so 1,500 years ago.
So he recreated I read that section.
He proved they did it. Yeah.
And then they went as far as, what was it, Iceland, and then they had to stop because of the weather, and they
I think he went all the way to Newfoundland.
Newfoundland, okay.
Yeah, he might not have made it all the way from Newfoundland to Nova Scotia, but he made it to Newfoundland.
And then they had to stop because of the weather, and then they continued again. But the point was they could do it.
They did it, yeah. Across the North Atlantic in an animal skin boat. And we find lots of these stone chambers that you mentioned earlier in New England that I think are related to that time period, that the Celts
I think so too.
The 6th century AD, were just starting to become Christianized, but they were still sort of pagan. And we see this confluence of sites. There's one in Connecticut called Gunjewamp, where we have Chi-Rho symbols, which are ancient Celtic symbols for Christ, but also pagan symbols alongside that, and these stone chambers that are aligned to the solstices and the equinoxes, and most importantly, to the cross-quarter days, which in the ancient Celtic, to the old Druids who were living in the British Isles at this time period, the cross-quarter days were more important than the solstices and equinoxes.
And why was that?
The cross-quarter days, they're halfway between a solstice and an equinox, and those are actually more reflective of the season. It's like, so for example, the Beltane, which everyone knows, the maypole dance, that's May 4th or 5th, that's sort of the beginning of summer, okay? That's a more accurate beginning of summer than June 21st. By then we're already into summer. Yeah. And the height of summer, August 4th, okay? That's the next, it's not Lunasa, it's Samhain.
The name of it.
Yeah, okay, it's either, I'm not even sure which one, but August 4th, that's really the height of summer. And then
almost harvest time. We're getting into
exactly.
harvest time.
And so for an agrarian society, this was the time, for example, on Beltane, where you'd put your animals out to graze. And so for the Druids and the Celts, for an agrarian society, those cross-quarter days were marked by these chambers and the sunrises and the sunsets, and we see this at America's Stonehenge as well.
I was just going to mention that, yeah.
Those days were more important. The solstices and equinoxes were important as well, but as were the cross-quarter days. And we see this a lot in the chambers.
We're pretty sure that the Druid Celt-type people were here in that first millennium. But you're saying your book is based on the premise that perhaps some of the Atlanteans came here, and Atlantis was purportedly swallowed up about 12,000
years ago? Right, so Atlantis, again, goes way back further than anything we're talking. We're talking the Phoenicians, that's 4,000 years ago. If we talk about Atlantis, we're talking 12,000 years ago. And we have that date from Plato. Plato's the one he gives this date. He gives a very specific date. He's writing in 300 BC, and he talks about 9,300 years prior to him. So we add it all up, and we end up with 11,600 years before today.
This is incredible.
And so he gives a very specific date, and then when we look at the geological survey charts and the temperature change charts, he's spot on with a huge event. It's called the end of the Younger Dryas, right at that same time, 11,600 years ago, where Earth temperatures rose about 15 degrees, and it basically ended the Ice Age. So the theory is that something happened 11,600 years ago that A, wiped out Atlantis, again, some kind of asteroid or meteorite, floods and earthquakes and volcanoes, and also warmed the Earth. Again, a massive impact would melt the polar cap, so we'd have these floods, but also global warming would occur. The energy released from this would cause global warming. So something happened right around 11,600 years ago that ended the Ice Age and apparently brought about the end of Atlantis. And my theory is that Atlantis, being an advanced civilization in the middle of the Atlantic, that few people would have survived. Maybe 1% of the population. They were out on a trading mission. They were on either side of the Atlantic doing whatever, trading.
A lot of them fled too to several parts of the world because they had been been foretold. So
yes, some just got lucky.
Some got lucky.
And they tried to continue this civilization, this advanced civilization. And we see bits and pieces of evidence of stuff right around 10,000 years ago, where you see these bursts of architectural advancement and technological advancement, tools and weapons and languages and art, ceramic kiln, all these things that don't have any other explanation. And they tried to keep things going, but they just didn't have the foothold. There wasn't enough of them. They didn't have the infrastructure. Yeah. I mentioned my wife is a sculptor. She's a potter. And if there were to be a cataclysmic event, she could still make rudimentary bowls and cups. But without her without electricity to run her kiln, and without being able to go to the supply shop and buy glazes, and without a supply of clay, she could do things, but they wouldn't be as good.
They'd be more
and
limited.
She could teach them to our daughters, but they wouldn't be as good as she would be. And eventually it would just die out. And I think that's what happened with a lot of this.
I'm going to have to hold you right there for just a couple minutes.
I'll just keep talking all day long. Yeah, sorry.
We're just about at the bottom of the hour, and we are talking to David Brody about his latest book, Echoes of Atlantis. And we'll be back in just a couple minutes. Back to Edge of Reality TV. I'm Willie Hassel along with Lynn Nickerson, and we are talking tonight with David S. Brody, the author of Echoes of Atlantis, a very fascinating book and very enjoyable read. And welcome back, David.
Welcome back.
Having a great time, thank you.
So we were talking about the book and how you think that perhaps there was an Atlantis, and we were talking about what supports that evidence. Right. So there are a couple of indicating factors that you've woven into your story, and this older lady who's supposed to be one of the cronies takes Amanda on a trip, and she shows her a couple of things. She takes her to the shores of New Jersey, and they talk about eels, and from there they talk about butterflies and some birds. So why don't you expand on the importance of the eels, the significance of it?
Right, so I mentioned in the first half hour that if we're going to prove the existence of a 12,000-year-old civilization in the middle of the Atlantic, you know, it's underwater now. The trail is cold. We're going to have to look at a wide range of different possible pieces of evidence. And one of the things I stumbled upon was a fascinating pattern of spawning by the North American eels. So, you know, the eels, we here in New England know that they live in the ponds and the lakes, and when they're born, they're a tiny little thing. They're called glass eels. But as they grow up and they get to be adults, they're 5 or 6 feet long. And
they're that big?
Yeah, and when they get to be about 15 years old, they swim down the rivers and streams along the eastern seaboard, and they come into the ocean. Even though they're freshwater animals, they come into the ocean. They swim out to the edge of the continental shelf, and they take a right-hand turn and they head south. And they get to an area called the Sargasso Sea, which is sort of a
weird place.
Very weird place. You have the Bermuda Triangle. You have all these reeds, and it's still water, and a very legendary, weird place.
Weird place.
Shallow waters, but this is where the eels end up spawning. And they spawn, and the young eels live there for about a year or two till they're old enough to make the return journey up to the north, and then they take a left and go west towards the lakes and the streams and up into the lakes and ponds, and then they repeat the cycle. But again, these are freshwater animals that come out to the salt water to spawn.
That's amazing.
Right, and
there's something called their way back.
There's something called nostophilia, which is the instinctive urge in animals to return to a native remote homeland. So I think what might have been happening is that at some point these were freshwater animals living in a freshwater habitat in the middle of the Atlantic. The habitat was lost, and yet the animals still remember to go back to the mid-Atlantic for spawning instinctively. What's fascinating is there are eels, freshwater eels in Europe that do the same exact thing, that when they get to be 15 years old, they swim down the stream out to the edge of the continental shelf, in their case west, out to the Sargasso Sea, where they join with their North American cousins and spawn and then head back to Europe. So not only do we have one group of eels doing this, which would be amazing enough in and of itself, but we have two groups doing it, and they go back to the same exact spot. To me, it almost screams out that this common origin location was in the middle of the Atlantic, a freshwater spot, and when it was destroyed, the eels fled east and west.
Yeah.
And that here we are, 12, 15,000 years later, they still go back, nostophilia, to their remote native homeland.
There's got to be some reason for it.
There's got to be some reason they both go back there.
Dave, do you think that that's something that is coded into their DNA,
Very
or do
much
you
so.
think it's a consciousness thing?
No, it's coded. It's
you think
instinctive.
it's coded in their DNA?
And the reason I think it's coded is because you mentioned the butterflies. In South America, on the northern coast, Guyana, the Catopsilia butterfly does a very similar thing every April. These beautiful yellow butterflies, tens of thousands of them gather, and they fly north. towards the
north
Sargasso
coast
Sea,
of
on the north coast of South America.
South America.
Guyana, which is just next to Venezuela. And they fly north for hundreds of miles, and they start circling around and around and around over the ocean. And eventually they collapse and die into the sea. Very sad.
So sad, yeah.
It is sad. But they are looking, their DNA tells them to look for an ancient homeland, which, so nostophilia apparently is even stronger than the survival instinct in the butterflies, which is why I think it's not a conscious decision, otherwise it'd stop doing it, right? It's silly. But they go back, so again, the same thing, at some point, thousands of generations ago, these butterflies remembered that to be their native homeland, and they still go back looking for it these many years later.
So if it might be DNA in conjunction with some kind of electromagnetic, pathways, some birds follow ley lines. Right. Do you think it might be something along the same chemical?
It could be, but I'm not sure it needs to even be that complicated. I think it's just, this is where, just like many animals, birds fly south, whatever, many animals return to their place of origin.
They do. Monarch butterfly flies south to Mexico, and they die along the way. It seems like their whole lifespan doesn't completely last the whole trip.
Right, but there had to have been some spot above sea level in the mid-Atlantic where these animals at one point lived.
At one point used to go. Yeah.
Right, and one of the pieces of research I did for this book was looking at 1930s U.S. Geological Survey drill results, and they do have evidence that about 12,000 years ago, there's volcanic ash on either side, on both sides of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. The ridge had to have been in places above sea level in order for volcanic ash to fall on it, obviously. They also found beach sand, freshwater fossils, all sorts of pieces of evidence indicating that parts, at least, of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge
had been higher.
Were higher. Now, we know some of that is still above water. Iceland is part of the ridge. The Azores Island is part of the ridge. St. Peter and St. Paul Island off of Brazil are part of the ridge. Most of the ridge is underwater. But apparently 12 to 15,000 years ago, a lot of the ridge was above water, above sea level. I think that's where Atlantis was. That's what the eels tell us, and so do the butterflies.
That is just an incredible
Yeah, the idea of me using biology, it's like a family joke, but my father and my grandfather are both doctors, and I'm the guy who would faint trying to dissect the frog, So the fact that I'm using biological research in some of my novels is pretty funny. But
it was excellent. How did you happen to come across that? Either one?
Just,
chance?
First of all, the internet's a wonderful thing because you start doing research and it just
connected,
and you just go, I don't know if I could have possibly written these kinds of books 20 years ago. I mean, it's just so much easier now to find material like that.
Yeah.
It really, and you asked earlier in the interview, why are we finally able to turn the ocean liner into people starting to open their eyes to these possibilities? Partly it's the power of the internet.
Yeah.
That people are able to access the material and share the material with each other, and I can communicate so easily with researchers in Iceland and Australia and on the West Coast, and I do a lot. That would have been really hard to do 20 years ago.
How about the red paint people that you talked about too? Now that is really interesting. They go way back, and you discovered a midden had been discovered, and there were bones underneath this, a shell midden.
Right.
And this was in Salisbury, Mass, which is really close to here.
Right. This is sort of where my research and the whole novel started. Was this dig that nobody really knows about from the 1970s or I believe 1980s in Salisbury, Massachusetts. The red paint people. They're known as the maritime archaic people. They were here before the Algonquin tribes. We're talking 6, 8, 10, maybe 11,000 years ago. They lived along the coastline in maritime Canada, Maine, Massachusetts. And the reason they're called the red paint people is they have a very unique burial practice. They believed in reincarnation. And so what they would do is when people died, they would paint the bones red with iron oxide. The belief being that when these people were reincarnated, they needed the red blood to live again. It's sort of an interesting idea. You need blood, so we got to give them some red blood on their bones, okay? What's fascinating about these red paint people is that we find red paint burial sites not just in maritime Canada and New England, but also in Central America, in the Orkney Islands north of Scotland, in Scandinavia, on the Iberian Peninsula. We have, again, the idea that all these different cultures independently invented the idea of painting their bones of their dead people red it defies common sense. I think you have to have a common origin for something like that. So that doesn't prove that the common origin was Atlantis, but it proves that these people who lived around the Atlantic Rim are somehow related. What I didn't mention, which I will right now, is that the tools and weapons that were found with these red paint people bones are incredibly advanced, okay? So they're far more advanced than we'd expect them to be for 8,000, 10,000 years ago. They're far more advanced than the later Algonquin tools and weapons. For example, a harpoon, which they shouldn't have been out doing deep sea fishing at that point in civilization, but they were.
That's right, they were sword fishing, weren't they?
It was sword fishing, maybe even whale fishing. It was a barbed harpoon, something we don't see coming into existence for thousands of years after that. Right. And they had serrated arrowheads. Now the Native Americans had arrowheads, but not serrated for thousands of years after that. It's almost like that these red paint people had advanced technology that was passed down to them, and they kept it. So again, we have this idea of a migration of peoples on both sides of the Atlantic with advanced technology. To me, that sort of, it doesn't just whisper in my ear, it screams in my ear, Atlantis.
Yeah.
You know, that's what might be going on here.
It does make you wonder.
And then we add to that, we find in Europe at one of the red paint burial sites, and this wasn't even my book because I didn't learn about it till afterwards, on research I'm doing on my new book, we found an ancient kiln, a kiln to make, and this is I pay attention to this because my wife's career as a potter and a sculptor, a kiln that was used high fire temperatures to cure clay. This was not supposed to have been invented till the Chinese invented it about 8,000 years ago, and yet we have this kiln going back 15 or 20,000 years at the same site as a red paint burial site. Okay, so again, we have these evidence of this advanced technology all around these red paint burial sites, whether it's weapons or tools or, in this case, a kiln. So something's going on with the people who buried their bodies and painted them red that is advanced.
Yeah.
So.
The kilns, you say 15 to 20,000
years?
Maybe
even a little slightly even older, maybe as far as 25,000. There's something called the Venus of Dolny, which is a Venus statuesque that was dated at almost 25,000 years ago, and it was fired in a kiln, not just fired like over a campfire, but in a really sophisticated kiln. The temperatures that would have been needed to get this to be fired the way it was.
Was that in Europe or is it here?
In Europe. In Europe.
In Europe.
In Europe, yes.
And were there some kilns found here, like in the Salisbury area, or not?
No.
No.
No. And again, part of the problem is, 12,000 years. There's just not much left.
Yeah.
It's really hard. You mentioned that in my novel, I sort of get around that by having these bones found under a shell midden. The bones in Salisbury really were not found under a shell midden, but I needed to get a justification for bones being preserved for 10 or 11,000 years, and the lime in the shells in this particular case would have done that. The actual Salisbury find is about 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, not quite back to Atlantis.
Not quite that far.
Really far back, but I had to fudge that a little bit to make it fit my story.
Yeah, but it worked.
Yeah, thank you.
Were there tools then found at this particular site? The advanced tools, like the serrated.
The serrated arrowhead and the barbed harpoon point, which indicates, as you mentioned, the people are out in the middle of the Atlantic fishing for swordfish and perhaps even whales. Remember, the Algonquin peoples who came in after them, they stuck to the rivers and lakes. They didn't need to go out. They didn't know how to go out to the ocean, didn't need to in their defense. But somehow we have this advanced ability that then died out afterwards.
For real, do you know what happened to the bones? Were they taken off the site?
The Salisbury bones, I had been told that they were at the Peabody Essex Museum, and I couldn't track them down there. I'd been told that they might be at the Andover Historical Society. Couldn't find them there. The University of Maine archaeologist is an expert on red paint burial sites, and somebody thought they might be there. What I did end up finding a bunch of the artifacts in a private collection in Rhode Island through, I don't think we've talked too much about the Freemasons and how they always seem to appear. I always like to joke that I go down these rabbit holes and I thrash around and I look up and there's always a bunch of Freemasons there waiting for me at the bottom. Like it seems like whatever I research, whether it's the Ark of the Covenant or the Knights Templar or Rosslyn Chapel or in this case, the red paint people bones, it's a good friend of mine who happens to be a high-level Freemason who
Yeah.
was involved in this archaeological dig back in the 70s or 80s, ended up with a lot of the artifacts just in his private collection. The state said, we don't need all of it, you can keep some of it. But again, it is funny how the Freemasons always seem to be
Get their hands in
around
it.
these things.
Hovering
So,
about.
yes.
The bones that they found, were any of them, or it was one particular person, right?
Right. So the one thing I can tell you about the bones, because I've seen pictures, and what's sort of interesting,
In fact, you've got a picture in the book, right?
I do, yes. I don't know if we can zoom in on this or not, but yeah. So this is
I
the.
don't think there's anybody there.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
We lost the cameraman.
We lost the camera. The bones, we got to go back for a second. So the prevailing wisdom is that all the Native Americans in North America, they came across the Bering Land Bridge, and therefore they are Asian in origin. That's the traditional belief.
Traditional theory.
The Native Americans will scream and holler, no, 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 we are not Native, we are not Asian. The Cherokee, for example, say, we came across the Sunrise Sea from the east. Okay. This particular red paint burial skeleton is clearly, I won't say clearly, is to those experts who study this stuff, clearly of European origin, not Asian features. You can tell by the skull and whatever.
Right.
Without getting too deep into it. But this skeleton that they found was Irish looking, for lack of a better word. Okay. So the idea that again, this clearly would have been pre-contact. So how do we have a non-Asian skeleton? So it just calls into question the entire idea that all the Native Americans ended up coming across the Bering Land Strait. It doesn't prove that they were from Atlantis, but it pretty does. It screams at us that they were from European origin somehow.
And there were probably more races than they're willing to admit as well.
Right. I think people
really
came
believe
both
that.
ways. I'm not saying they didn't come across the Bering Land Strait, but but not all of them.
There are some, I believe, that did come through the Bering.
course.
There are some Native Americans, quote the Eskimos, and some of the Northwest Indians in North America. They do have some Asian characteristics.
Clearly.
But then you get, the people in the South, the Pima, the Zuni. They're not Asian. They don't look Asian to me.
Right.
And you've got so many different tribes, so many different language groups too, of the North American Native Americans, the indigenous people. There are several different races.
And let's give credit to the Smithsonian. There's an archaeologist there by the name of Dennis Stanford who, and normally the Smithsonian is pretty conservative about this kind of stuff, but he has proposed a theory that about 15,000 years ago, the Solutrean theory, that there was a migration of Europeans coming across the Atlantic that settled along the east coast of North America, and that a significant percentage of the North American Native Americans are part of this migration group. He calls it I think he calls it the small boats or the many boats theory, I forget, but the idea being that during the Ice Age, the water levels were much lower, and there were more islands, and there was more it was a shorter trip because the shorelines were extended further out, and that they basically island hopped their way across, and there are tools, the Solutrean tools, that he claims proves this, and I think he's right, but at least somebody is willing to open their eyes to, again, what the Native Americans are screaming at us for generations, that they keep telling us what their oral history is, and we just
ignore it.
We ignore it
like
because
they're stupid.
they didn't write it down. How can it be true if they didn't write it down? Well, that's just what they did. They preserved their history through legend and through storytelling, and that was their culture, and we should respect
passed it down. I mean, they would have little apprentices, and they would apprentice all life long and learn this stuff, so that it would be passed down to the generations.
We act like just because we write our history that it's impeccably unflawed, and we know that to be false.
Yeah. So those bones that they found in Salisbury actually weren't giant bones, right?
Not giant bones,
okay.
no. But they were significantly larger than we would consider, 6'2" in that range.
Yeah.
Much larger than a typical Asian skeleton from that time period would have been. There
was another comment too that was made. I believe Dennis Stone made this comment that when they found the sacrificial stone at Stonehenge,
yes.
Everyone keeps saying that yes, the Native Americans built the stone walls and built Stonehenge, and they had an Algonquin. I don't remember which tribe he was, but he was an Algonquin speaking person, and he said, "This wasn't our people. We didn't do this."
So Dennis tells us this. I brought a Native American tribal chief there to the site, a Wampanoag chief, And he said, he said, this is an amazing site, but we didn't do this.
We didn't do
so
this.
I told Dennis that story, and apparently Dennis has been feeding it, which is good for him. But yeah, this was a couple of years ago. I brought, because I was tired of hearing that the Native Americans did this, and finally I said, well, let's bring a Native American chief. You know, you tell us. And he spent a good day with me there, and essentially said that this is nothing like anything we've ever done. We didn't do this. This is, you know,
they
this is not what we do.
didn't build walls. It was the colonials that built walls.
They sometimes built these sweat lodges.
Oh, that's a different story.
Yeah, but they never put a roof on it, because the idea was they would get in these spirit lodges, or they have these spirit quests.
Yes.
And they would want the spirits to come down and come into their head, and so they would never put a roof on anything if they wanted to do that. Well, the America Stonehenge site is full of chambers with roofs.
Yeah.
And so my Wampanoag friend said, we don't do this. You know, we didn't do this, and we don't. You know, and it's not our stuff.
So it just says, you know, we've got to look further. We just can't stick to these theories that they're forcing all these round pegs in square holes.
Exactly. Yeah. That's exactly.
Wow. Okay, so throughout the whole story, I just want to mention this real quickly, but certainly I'd like you to get on to a couple of your other books too, if you'd like to mention those. The necklace that plays a predominant role throughout this book, it pulsates, but there are several. And when I saw that, I thought, it really sounds like a moonstone, the old moonstone that they call the mood stone.
Mood stone, exactly, yes.
The person's personality or mood would change the color of the stone. And I think that, you know, that principle probably is operative here, although maybe that wasn't what you'd intended.
Well, no, I think I described the necklace as being very similar to the old mood stones, that they change different colors based on your mood. I don't want to talk too much about the necklace, because it's sort of the crucial reveal in the plot. I don't want to give it away to people who want to read the book. But I did have fun with sort of the ancient technology in the story. The necklace may be able to transmute lead and other heavy metals into gold. And I had some fun with that part of the story, that maybe that's what the Atlantean technology was, one of the things they were able to do.
Personally, do you think that alchemy is possible?
What I get into in the book, it's not alchemy, it's not chemistry, and that's part of the issue. Again, here I'm talking about biology before, I got to stay away from the sciences, but it's more physics. It's more about knocking a proton off than it is about some kind of chemical alteration. And we've seen that the Soviets, when they were, they had a lead cap on a nuclear reactor, and through, you know, a huge amount of energy release, that lead cap turned to gold, because the energy knocked a proton off of the lead. And so it's been proven that we can turn lead into gold. It costs 1,000 times more than the gold is ever worth, so it doesn't make any sense to do it. But it is possible. But alchemy, the problem with the ancient alchemists is they tried to do it through a chemical reaction. It turns out you need to have a massive energy burst to make it a physics reaction. And then I'm going to stay away from the sciences after that. I'm done with science, okay? 'Cause I'm going to get in trouble if I go too far with this.
You do have about 3 or 4 minutes left.
Okay. How about the witch logo that you use throughout?
Yeah, so the witch, this goes back to the question of independent invention or common origin. In Central America, the ancient ancient goddess of what we'll just call her a witch, the ancient goddess of unclean things like menstruation and the kinds of things that we think of when we think of ancient witches. Her name is Tlazoltotl, and she's depicted, and these depictions are pre-contact, pre-European contact, she's depicted with a black pointy hat riding a broomstick. Pre-contact. So we've got Tlazoltotl looking an awful lot like the European witches. So is it possible that the Europeans and the South Americans, Central Americans, both came up with the idea to have a black pointed hat on a witch riding a broomstick, or did one invent it and the other one inherit it? Common origin. Again, these kinds of things scream to me that at one point there was some kind of communication between the Europeans and Central Americans, and that witch figure is pretty good evidence of that.
That is really interesting.
And so I had a lot of fun with her, because I used her as my scene separator. Between every scene, there's the witch again with her on her broom and her black hat.
How about some of your other books then, Dave? Would you like to tell us about?
So this is, as you mentioned, this is the 6th in a series. You can look at them at davidbrodybooks.com and read more about them. They're all standalone, but they all essentially deal with the idea of explorers here coming across the Atlantic prior to Columbus. Going back 600 years or 800 years or 1,500 years or 3,500 years or 12,000 years. I sort of take a period and look at the different possibilities. And there are sites and artifacts around, mostly New England that I look at, but all across the country that are evidence of these explorations. And I turn them into, hopefully a thrilling roller coaster ride, but they're all set in modern times. And the idea is readers will learn about this hidden history at the same time they have hopefully a fun read.
Yeah,
and you say you're working on number 7 now.
Number 7, yes.
You want to tell us a little bit about that?
The title is The Cult of Venus.
Of Venus?
Of Venus. And it goes into the fact that ancient cultures all worshipped the goddess. We think today, almost every culture today thinks of
male
God as being a male bearded deity. But 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, everybody worshipped a female goddess. I mentioned Astarte, the child's name. I mentioned also the Venus statue that we found from the kiln from 25,000 years ago.
And this one here?
This one, yeah. So my wife made this. She's a sculptor, as I mentioned. She happened to make this for the book, but this is a Venus sculpture she did, goddess sculpture she did for me.
Excellent.
But the idea being, so what caused humankind to move away from the goddess and to the god, and what were the ramifications of that, and is the pendulum swinging back the other way? We've all seen the show. I think it was Hair, the dawning of the age of Aquarius, right? Where the Aquarius, of course, being a female because of the water, and so are we going back to swinging back towards the worship of the goddess?
It's kind of a continuation of Cameron and Amanda and Astarte, right?
Right.
They're incorporated into that.
Yeah, and Astarte, the prophecy for Astarte when she was born was that she was going to be this prophetess that was going to sort of unite the world's religions. And now in my next book, she's finally coming of age, and she believes she might be the voice of the goddess, and that's where we go with that whole story. So it's a little bit off, a little bit away from artifacts. There's plenty of artifacts in it, but again, I'm on a sort of an exploration of my own to try to understand our world history a little better. So.
Well, it's a great storyline.
Oh,
And yeah. And your website and whatnot?
Yeah, DavidBrodyBooks.com. You can read about the books there, and love to hear from readers, questions, comments, criticisms.
Good.
Writing's a lonely profession, so it's always nice to hear from,
yeah, isn't it? I know.
Hear from readers.
You said spend hours at the computer.
Right.
All right. Well, David, we thank you very much
Thank you for
joining
having
us
me.
tonight.
It's been a real pleasure.
Very much enjoyed. It's
Thank
always
you.
a pleasure speaking with both of you. Thank you.
Well, we really enjoy having you on, and hopefully we'll do it again.
I would love to come back when my next book is
Talk
out.
about
All right.
Venus.
Talk about Venus.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Yes,
Definitely.
excellent.
We'll
Thank you so much.
Have you on the radio show. We'll have you back here.
Very
Yep.
good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And you've been watching Edge of Reality TV. Our guest tonight, David S. Brody, author of a number of books, his latest being Echoes of Atlantis. And I guess that's about it for
That
tonight.
wraps up another great show.
Okay, so we will talk to you again next month.
See you next month.
Good night.